What's going on, animators? Welcome. We're so glad to have you all here for episode number 5 of our RIFF animation podcast. And you're all in for a treat because we are so fortunate to have joining us today. Miss Amy Smeed is in the building, and she's been at Disney for many years at this point, and was the head of animation on Raya, head of animation on Strange World, most recently head of animation on Moana. Just has a wealth of knowledge and so much to share. And we're going to get into all of that in a minute. Amy, thank you so much for joining us. And buckle in, you guys are in for a treat, as I said. So let's get right into it. Amy, I can't thank you enough for stopping by to spend some time with us today. Let's start at the beginning. Tell the viewers out there what originally drew you into this field of animation. How did you find your way into the industry?
Sure. So and thank you for having me. It was nice when you reached out and asked. I'm happy to be here. So I think for me, I grew up in Michigan, and I was always interested in my art classes. I especially loved painting, and I went to 2 different colleges. The first school I went to was one in Michigan, and I was taking lots of painting and graphic design classes. And my 3rd year in, I woke up and thought, okay, what am I going to do with this? And if I'm really serious about painting, then maybe I should transition to more of a fine art school. So I transferred to a school in Chicago, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and it was a school that really wants you to try other things and experiment. So I ended up taking an animation class and totally fell in love with that. So while I was still continuing to take painting and graphic design, I started to shift my focus more towards animation. And it's funny when I think back now, because I grew up watching all of the Disney films, but it never really occurred to me that that was a job that someone could get. So I took the character animation, and I started focusing more into character animation. And I will say, though, when I graduated from school, my reel was not very strong. So I didn't really feel like I could attain a job as a character animator at a studio like Disney. But I also thought if I could just get my foot in the door, then I could learn from all the talented people around me. So I ended up getting a position in a department called Scene Setup, which doesn't exist anymore. But it was on the film Dinosaur, which was, gosh, what was that, like 25 years ago? But it was basically a department that helped shepherd scenes through the pipeline, because a lot of people at that time were coming from stop motion animation or very new in CG animation, because it was a very new medium at the time. So I had that position, and then I would just spend nights and weekends doing animation tests and trying to build a stronger portfolio. And then on the project of Chicken Little, they started up their trainee program. And so I applied for that, was assigned an official mentor, and then shortly after that was promoted to assistant animator and then animator. So I guess it took me a little while once I was at the studio, where, when you graduate from school and you're like, this is just what I want to do. But it took me about 4 or 5 years at the studio before I actually became a character animator.
So that's awesome that you basically started right there, and then you were able to kind of transition into the role that it was that you wanted to begin with. So when you were studying in college, you were studying computer animation, or were you doing traditional animation at first?
It was the very beginning of computer animation, and I think my teacher had just taken the computer animation course like the year before, so it was pretty new. We did have a traditional animation department. It was more experimental, and so I didn't end up taking any of those. I regret that. If I were to go back in time, I would take those classes. But I think because I was getting into animation so late and trying it out, and then a year and a half later I was supposed to graduate, so I just continued taking as many computer animation classes, and then other computer classes that were like Photoshop and stuff like that.
So goodness, I mean, I'm trying to think timing wise, because this sounds like you said, the kind of the bleeding edge of computer animation in terms of films and jobs, right? So timing wise, like you kind of hit that just right. I feel like that's probably a couple of years after Toy Story came out. At this, right? That would
Yeah,
have been what, 98 or something. I think Dinosaur.
yes. I was in school when Toy Story came out. I remember I think it
Wow.
was my first class, and we were watching Knick Knack and was it Luxo Jr.? Was that one of the
Yeah.
first ones? I'm trying to remember the first ones that, yeah. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. How do they do this? So yeah, it was very, very early on. And I can't remember what year Toy Story came out, but I feel like it was when I was still in school.
Yeah, yeah, that was 1995, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. Okay.
Wow, so that's really kind of fortuitous timing that right as things were kind of transitioning, because after that there would obviously be, even with the Disney studios, quite a bit of turn to, uh, almost everything being computer animation
Yeah.
nowadays, right?
Yeah.
Um, Wow. So can you tell me what was that like being there during? And I know you were doing scene setup originally, but even most of the people there, I imagine, hadn't really done any considerable amount of computer animation because it was all so new. What was that like? Was it kind of like a culture of everyone sort of learning together, or?
Yeah, definitely. And I been in the year before, a year and a half before, 'cause my husband is also an animator, and he came in about a year and a half, 2 years before I did, and he was part of a group of trainees that came up basically in to learn CG animation for the project of Dinosaur. When I came into Dinosaur, we were almost, I would say, probably about halfway through animation at that point. But it was definitely a culture of everybody learning, and there was a group of people that came from stop motion animation. One of our directors, Eric Layton, came from stop motion animation, so I think he brought over part of that crew from like Nightmare Before Christmas and that. So it was, and then after we finished that production, so we were using a program called Softimage, and then the interesting thing is for all the facial animation that was animated in a program called Mugshot, and so
Mm.
like I said, I wasn't animating at the time, but the animators and my tests that I was doing at the time, we would be comping on the face to out of Mugshot onto a Softimage body of a dinosaur and then showing that to the
Oh wow.
directors. So the necks are going through the upper body, and I would love to find some of those tests because it'd be funny to look at. But it was definitely a community of learning, and I remember we all went through a boot camp right before Chicken Little, where we'd all go into the training lab. And at that time, it was Eamon Butler that was running that boot camp and was teaching all of us more the traditional way of setting up all of your keys and then going into breakdowns before going into one. So it was, I know there's different styles of and workflows of whether you are working on keys or going straight into spline and doing more of a layer approach. But at that time, we were definitely taught the more traditional way of your key poses. And I learned so much at that time. It was an amazing experience.
And so then, so you're doing the scene setup, and then did you say that Chicken Little was your first film, where you actually got to do some animation?
Yeah, yeah. So there were, I think, four of us. So after Dinosaur, there wasn't a whole lot of CG projects, and
Mhm.
they Disney started doing some live action projects like Rain of Fire, and I'm trying to remember what else was at that time. So some of the CG animators went on to those live action projects while we were waiting
Mhm.
for basically Chicken Little or something like that. So then there were four of us that were hired as apprentices, and then we were assigned official mentors, and then from there, I think we were only in that program about 3 months before we transitioned straight into assistant animators and then animators shortly after that. So it was an amazing opportunity, and looking back on the rigs at that time, everything was IK. I don't think we had any FK controls, which was, in a way, at the time, we were like, this is amazing because you can do anything you want. But I can't imagine now animating on an only IK rig.
Yeah. So who was your mentor when you were first training out?
Yeah, my official mentor was Jason Ryan, who I learned
Wow.
so much from. Jason's amazing
Me too.
and a really nice guy. Yeah, he was a great
Yeah.
mentor. My husband, I think I mentioned, also is an animator. So I feel like he's kind of been an unofficial mentor to me over the years. He's someone that we
Mhm.
always show each other our work, and I've learned so much from him over the years. And then I would say working on Meet the Robinsons, a lot of our traditional animators were being trained into CG. So people like Nick Ranieri, Dale Bear, I learned so much from them on Meet the Robinsons. And then, of course, going on to Tangled and getting the chance to work with Glenn was an incredible opportunity because you get to work with Glenn Keane, who's drawing over your animation and really diving into strong posing and strong silhouettes and just what is the character thinking. So I feel like I've had a lot of unofficial mentors over the years and people that I've learned from, but Jason Ryan was my official mentor and very grateful for all the time he spent with me.
Yeah, I love Jason. I many years ago took a lot of classes over at I Animate and got to
Oh
know
yeah,
him
yeah,
well
yeah.
through that program.
He's
Uh,
awesome.
yeah, very cool. And I heard you mention Eamon Butler as well, and I know both of them transitioned, I guess, up to Cinesite recently or more recently. Wow. So I'm hearing really kind of somewhat direct path in a lot of ways, right? From school to Disney. So that's the only place that you've worked, really, right?
Yes, unless you include all the jobs I had as a teenager.
Oh
I
no,
had a
as
paper
an
out.
animator, but no.
Yeah,
So that's exciting because a lot of people's career in this industry can tend to involve a lot of hopping around. It could be, sometimes itinerant and shorter contracts and these types of things. And so that you've, had a long, illustrious career at the same studio is really awesome and kind of, I'm sure a testament to the type of person you are and the people enjoy working with you. But can you speak to that at all in terms of like having been somewhere so long and really seeing it evolve and seeing it kind of make that transition, into to more 3D features and then really kind of exploding onto the scene, in a new way, a place that has such a long history and storied in traditional animation, of course, but then really kind of taking the world by storm, I'll say, in the 3D animation space as well. But can you speak to what that was like, kind of being there through so many different
sure.
phases and periods of the studio?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny to think back on that time because so much has changed. Around Chicken Little was when a lot of the traditional animators were being trained. And again, I feel very fortunate that I got to work with so many of them because I learned so much from them just on the principles of animation. I think, and I imagine it was a tough time for them going from seeing, a lot of the hand drawn films um, going, there are much less of them being made. Um, but I feel lucky that I got the opportunity to work with them. And then I think when John and Ed came in, that was a big change just in how we started telling our stories and who was telling the stories, and it became more director driven. And they were really breaking down a lot of the barriers within the studio. So there was a time when if we had a question for, say, a layout artist or a different artist in a different department, we would have to go through our production supervisor and ask if we could talk to someone. Where when John and Ed came, they kind of broke down all those walls and you could go straight to the layout artist or straight to whoever. So that was, it seems like such a small thing, but it opened, I would say, collaboration between different departments to where we are today. And it's such a collaborative studio, which is one of the things that I love about leadership is working with other departments and building a film or a character together as a team. Because I think there's sometimes a misconception that animators do everything. And like we do a tiny piece of this puzzle, but there's all these other people that are being involved in the process, and as a team you're building something hopefully really amazing. So that was a huge transition. I think today where we're at, I love that we're in a place where it feels like we're telling more diverse stories. We at our studio, at least, we've brought in a number of new directors that have come from all different backgrounds, and so that's exciting to see. It's exciting to see what we have in development, and hoping to have the opportunity to work on those projects as well.
Yeah. So can you, I guess that's sort of the elephant in the room sometimes, right? Is that this industry, especially back then, I imagine, could tend to be quite a bit of a boys' club, right? There's it's just a very male-dominated field, or has been for a long time, and there have been obviously some sizable strides made in that arena, obviously over the past 20 years or so. What was that experience like when you started? Were there a lot of other female animators, or was it slim pickings?
Yes, one of my best friends, Becky Brzee, who's also an animator at the studio. I think back when I think of a film, say like Meet the Robinsons, and me and her and Yuri, there was probably maybe five of us, where now that number has grown drastically. It's still not 50-50%, but it's that percentage is much higher. I think for me, I always felt really lucky to have great leadership. So I I don't know that it occurred to me as much as maybe other studios or even other jobs where, I mean, yes, I know that I'm one of the only females in the room. Um, but I do feel really lucky that I've had people supporting me. And I feel very fortunate for that because I know that not everybody's been in that same position. So, um, so yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Um, so so Chicken Little, Meet the Robinsons. Did you work on Bolt as well after that, or
Yeah. Yes, that's I had my
okay?
dad
So
on.
so at that point, you're you know you've been there a while, and I'm sure starting to feel more comfortable as an animator in the studio. What was your path, from those kind of earlier films into leadership? Like, when did that happen? And was that sort of organic? Was that something that you had aspirations to do, or were you tapped to, just kind of start stepping into a leadership position? Or can you describe what that transition was like?
Yeah. I would say it was a hard transition for me. I think I it was not something I think I ever thought of. I was happy being an animator. I loved animating and I was happy to do that the rest of my life. The opportunity came up on Moana and I had people from our department reaching out to me and people in various places in the studio wanting me to put my name in the hat for that project. And I was very hesitant too because I didn't have the confidence in myself. I think I always thought, oh, so and so will do a better job. We have incredible animators in our department. And I just never thought I would be in a position like that, which makes me sad to think about today. But like I said, I had a lot of people supporting me. So I did put my name in the hat and got the position. My partner was Hiram Osmond, who was an incredible partner. He was so supportive of me. I learned so much from him and so much from, I mean, a huge part that made it scary too is Ron and John are people that we all look up to as animators, right? And I think at the time I was like, I don't want to disappoint them. What if I do this horrible job in this role? Which it seems silly to think about that now, of because one person can't ruin a project. um, but but it was really scary for me. So but I'm just so fortunate. And like I said, I had a lot of people supporting me, and that's where I think even in leadership roles, some of the guys that were in leadership roles supporting me. So it felt like I was in good hands, even though it was scary. And I think most of that show, I was trying to figure out where my place is and how not to screw up the job. Um, but I learned so much from everybody on that show, and I'm just so thankful to have had that experience. When I will say one of the things I love about our studio, and I'm not sure if this is how it is for you as well. Once you're in a leadership position, you go back to an animator, so you have to reapply for the next project if you want to be a head of animation or supervising animator. I love that because after Moana, I did miss animating. I didn't get to animate a whole lot on Moana. So I went back into an animator spot on Wreck-It Ralph 2. And then Raya came up, and I loved the directors on that project. I loved where that project was going, and ended up putting my name in the hat for that. And then I had a different partner at that time was Malkin Pierce. And Malkin it's funny because he and Hiram are so different and the way they lead is different. Their animation styles, I would say, are different. And I feel lucky that I got the opportunity to work with the both of them because I learned so much from them in very different ways, creative ways and leadership ways. And then same with going into Strange World. My partner was Justin Sklar, who's an incredible leader and animator. And again, learned so much from that process. So I feel very lucky, but it was very daunting at first. And I guess I think for me after Moana, I spent a lot of time doing a lot of self-reflection on what I enjoyed about the role, maybe what I didn't enjoy about the role. And a lot of it had to do with the confidence in myself. And so I feel like even though there's times where I might lack confidence, I think I've grown a lot in that area. And I feel like even me as a person, I feel like I've grown a lot since having those opportunities. And I've just learned a lot about
Yeah.
myself in there.
Oh,
It's
go
about
ahead.
taking chances and risks, right? And
Yeah.
I think as an animator, we do that every day, even without being in leadership. You're taking a risk on what is the idea you're going to come up with for your animation. You can take a big risk and put yourself out there, or you can make a safe choice. And hopefully, you're working with directors and heads that are going to give you that chance to take risks and help you feel like you can take those risks, because that's how you're going to bring your best work forward.
Prior to being head of animation or co-head of animation, right, with Hiram on Moana, had you been a supervisor prior to that, or did you go straight from animator to head in that case?
Yeah, I went straight from animator to head, and which I think was also a little bit
Wow.
scary for me. So I, by that point,
Yeah.
I had been at the studio for about 15 years, I think, 14, 15
Yeah.
years roughly. So I had worked under many different types of leaders. And so I think for me, it was about taking all the things, thinking about the projects where I was doing my best work and who I admired from a leadership standpoint, and trying to take all of those things and build that into what I would find, who I would want to work under as a leader. So I learned a lot from all of them.
So I love Moana. I love most Disney movies, honestly, but I have a penchant for musicals, and I'm a big Lin Manuel Miranda fan
Yeah.
as well. It's just such a epic scope. Wh- wh- it seems like a lot of the projects that you're on, they're very physical shows, right? In a lot of ways, I'm thinking specifically of Raya, right? That
Absolutely.
much action and stuff is involved in a show like that, and obviously bringing in martial artists and studying all these types of things.
Yeah.
Do you tend towards that type of animation? Like, are there types of animation that you kind of prefer to do, or like a little more daunted? Find a little more daunting in terms of like physicality, acting. Like, do you gravitate towards one more than the other?
Yeah, I for sure do. And it's funny because you're right, those films are so physical, but I actually gravitate more towards the acting, and especially subtle acting. I love doing, you were talking about musicals earlier. I love musicals so much. So, Moana was a musical, and it was fun. We had a choreographer that helped us coming up with specific dance moves and all of that. For me, with physicality, I I am someone when I'm animating, I'll shoot reference, but if there's something that I can't physically do, then I will often look to YouTube or whatnot and try to find clips of something just to be inspired by, and find mainly the mechanics part of it. But I definitely gravitate towards more of the emotional acting sort of thing.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned that once you have to kind of reapply, I guess, to be ahead of each show, and then
Yeah.
you do get kind of to go flex those animator muscles again. Between if you want to work on some shows,
Yeah.
um, are there still you've been there a long time at this point. I'm sure you've touched most types of shots. Are there still types of shots that you hope to get to work on? Are there things that you feel like you haven't yet explored, or would like to get a chance to do?
I think, let's see. I love doing musical shots so much, singing and I mean, I got to animate on Frozen 1 where I got to work on some of the musical sequences. I guess Tangled as well. But I feel like I guess since Moana, I haven't been really on a musical. So I would love to get back into that. Um, in terms of shots that I mean, I think we're always trying to push ourselves, right? So it's one of those things that's very daunting and scary, but it's also that's how you get better. And I think I think maybe something where there is a little bit more physicality with say singing would be maybe somewhere that I would want to push. But I don't know. there's so many different areas that I enjoy working on so much. So I think it's hard to pick any specific thing, but it would probably be something to do with singing shots because I haven't gotten to do a ton of them, and I love musicals.
Well, so I mean, you kind of touched on it there, but looking back on your tenure at Disney, are there certain projects that are standouts in terms of just really enjoying that show, or you know, sometimes maybe it's the leadership or the actual shots you got to do. Are there certain shows that stand out as kind of favorites throughout the years?
Yeah. I would say definitely Tangled would be one of them, and a huge part of that would be getting the opportunity to work with Glenn. And Byron and Nathan are two directors. I think looking at all of the animation we were doing leading up to that film, I'm embarrassed. I'm so embarrassed to look at my work before Tangled, but not to say that I'm so proud of everything now, because I think as we're learning and growing, I look at my stuff from Tangled now, and I'm like, oh, I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have done that. But I think that project was so special to me because it was my first musical. My friend Becky and I shared an office, and were seeing that in development, and we were like, we want to work on this so bad. Um, and then we got the chance to. So that was a very special project for me. And I feel like I grew so much on that film. And then I loved Frozen. I mostly worked on Anna on that project. And what I loved about her is I feel like we got to have a little bit more fun with Anna because she's a little bit quirky, and Elsa's very, stands up straight, and I love Elsa too, but I feel like I had more fun with Anna, so that was a special project. And I guess going back to the types of shots that I love to animate, I had animated a shot on Let It Go that ended up being cut and reimagined, and then it came back towards the end of the project, and out of all the sequences in the film, I really wanted to work on Build a Snowman. Do you want to build a snowman? And there was an emotional moment at the end that I so badly wanted to work on. And so they came and said, well, Amy, you have to pick between the two. You can either reanimate the shot from Let It Go or have Build a Snowman. And I chose Build a Snowman because I just loved that moment so much of the two girls. So that was a very special project. And then, of course, Moana, because it's just getting the chance to work really closely with Ron and John, and having the opportunity as a head and working so closely with Hiram was a really special project. And Raya was special too. Just we had such a fantastic team, and I think that was another directing team I really loved working with. Our directors put so much trust into our team as well as the animators, and it felt like the animators could really bring something to the table, and as long as it's serving the story, the directors were cool with that. So that was another project that we just had so much. It was a bummer because we all got forced into the pandemic, but I feel like in some ways it brought people closer together as well. Everybody was helping each other out and figuring out how are we going to do this. So that is another. I guess they're all special, but I guess if
Yeah, it's hard. I know it's hard to choose, but
it's hard.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt the same way about. I remember when Tangled came out, and that was like the gold standard for so long. Of like, it was just so good. Like all the animation still holds up. I know, like you say, you look back at your work, many years later, and there's always something you would change. But that film was just so well done. There's so much appeal, and that was like one of the first times that a 3D film had really kind of hit that level of appeal, to the point that it does hold up, so many years later. I actually had an opportunity, the first time I ever visited Disney was, I think, I want to say 2004, my last year at college at SCAD. They brought a group of us out there, and you guys were just finishing up Chicken Little. We were about to release, and they showed us development stuff on. It was still called a Day with Wilbur Robinson, American Dog at the time. Bolt was still called. They showed us some concept stuff, and it was really exciting to kind of. That was my first time, visiting the studio and kind of seeing things that were in development, and they showed us some clips from Chicken Little, and it was just really fun and exciting. And obviously those early films paved the way for all the ones that everyone knows and loves so much today. But it's exciting that that's kind of right when you were making your way into the ranks of the studio. So that's pretty cool.
We probably crossed
Yeah.
paths and didn't even know it.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, whenever you're kind of like on the cusp of one of those sort of revolutions of sorts, yeah, it's like the sky's the limit, and there's just so much learning and growth and figuring out things together, and the collaboration, like you mentioned, is really exciting. And so yeah, I'm sure that was a fun time to maybe a little uncertain time, but also fun
Sure.
to be
Yeah.
there as that kind of transition was happening.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, you've been, leading for a long time now, as well as head of animation. Do you have additional aspirations beyond that in terms of, directing or moving into some of those types of roles at all, in terms of telling more involved in like the storytelling side of things, or are you kind of happy where you're at, continuing to do that?
I am happy doing what I'm doing right now, but I do often wonder, I would love to learn more about the storytelling side of things and also cinematography. I
Hmm.
have taken a bunch of photography classes, so I understand when I'm at meetings and they talk about lens choices and all that sort of thing. But I would love to learn more about cinematography and just story. It would be fun to come up with that idea and maybe direct a short someday or something like that. But it's I very much, and this is, I've learned this about myself, but I still hold myself back sometimes to where you feel like you have to know everything about story or everything about this other thing to move to the next level. So I'm trying to get that out of my head, but that would be the next place that I've been trying to evolve more in.
Do you still find much time? I know you originally mentioned kind of the fine arts background and wanting to be a painter. Do you still find much time to paint? Do you make
Nope.
time to kind of flex those muscles, or no?
I
That's fair.
don't. Um, I I haven't painted in a very well, my daughter likes to paint, and so every once in a while we'll sit and paint together, but it's nothing, it's like for an hour. It's not, that I'm sitting down for a weekend and really doing a painting. So I think um I think I just run out of time, and there's other things that like gardening or baking and other things, and especially just having a daughter, trying to hang out with her. So there's those types of things in
Yeah.
my life now. So I don't really have a lot of time for painting. But I think also I've had other interests. So
With two animator parents, does she have the bug? Does she have an art bug in her that she wants to pursue those things as well, or?
I I would say she is very creative, and I think she's really gotten into photography, and she loves wildlife so much. So she's 15, so she's a freshman in high school. So pretty soon she'll be looking into colleges, hopefully. But I would say she is creative. She does love to draw and paint, but she especially loves photography, at least for right now. So we'll see where that goes, if anywhere.
Well, so one thing I like to ask when we have our guest on, just to kind of hear different perspectives, what excites you about the future of the industry? Like, where do you see things going in terms of progressing, or different types of stories you'd like to see told, or different voices you'd like to hear, um, or have see have opportunities to tell stories. Just any thoughts or musings that you have on kind of either the state of the industry now, and or what you hope for the future of the animation industry.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen a lot of great changes over the last few years with the stories that we're telling and with bringing in different voices into the studio. So that's probably the most exciting thing to me is getting to work with directors from different backgrounds that are coming from different parts all over the world. I would say too something. I mean, just watching Spider-Verse come out um, a few years ago and watching just the different techniques that they were using in that film was exciting, just to see different people stylizing animation in different ways. So I'm excited for that side of things as well. I feel like it's we've seen so much change, and some of it is okay, what's to come that we're not even thinking of right now. But I think that, like you were saying, I think the most exciting thing for me is I mean, I lucky, and you are too, where we're at, where we get to see what's in development that we can't talk about, but seeing the different types of stories that are being told. So that's exciting.
So what would you say, to a lot, most of our listeners are animators or aspiring animators. What would you say to someone who's, just getting going, hoping to kind of get their first break in the industry, is there any advice you would give to them, or things they should be aware of or be focusing on as they're trying to, kind of either put a reel together or whatever it
Yeah.
is, as they're hoping to, one day land at a Disney or Pixar or whatever like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the very first thing I would say is make sure you put yourself out there, because I've talked to many students in the past that feel like their reel isn't perfect, so they're not going to apply, and you should absolutely apply. And then the second thing is there are just don't give up on yourself, because there's a finite amount of spots and you might not get it this round, you might not get it the next round, but just keep honing your skills and don't give up and feel like, oh, you can't do this because you've been turned down a couple times. There's so many animators that we work with that didn't make it in, the first few years that they're applying, and then they make it, several years later. And I think that's similar to myself, where when I graduated school, my reel was horrible, but I I had my job, but then I would work on weekends and nights and just develop my portfolio. And then it took 4 or 5 years, but then that opportunity came, and now I'm here where I am at today. But I think sometimes people can give up a little bit too soon. So I would say just believe in yourself and don't give up. And then I think the other thing I find oftentimes what happens is students want to take on a 500 frame animated, almost like a short, but then you don't ever get the chance to really focus on the character performance and getting to the high level of polish that's needed for a demo reel. So I would focus on giving yourself shorter assignments. If it can be under 200 frames, even 150, that's great, because it won't be as daunting and you won't get tired of it. Because that's the other thing I see happening is people will dive into this big test and then they start getting tired of it. They're, after week 4, but then so they don't end up finishing it, and then you can't put that on a reel. So take bits and pieces that are more manageable. And for me, what I was doing as I was first learning is I would do a test and I would say, okay, obviously you're always trying to think of all the principles of animation, but it's a lot to think about. So focusing on, say, physicality or mechanics and really diving into that, and then maybe your next test is more facial performance, but just trying to think smaller instead of this huge thing with massive mechanics and massive performance, so you don't get overwhelmed.
Yeah, that's great. I like that a lot. Is there a certain part of the process that you kind of like or enjoy the most? I know some people really love, the acting, and some people love getting, on the hopping on camera and doing reference. Some people hate that; they're cringe. They like want to get through that as quickly as possible, and they love to polish splines or whatever. Is there a certain part of the process that you kind of enjoy the most?
Yes. And this is where I would say my husband and I are the exact opposites. Well, not the exact, we're similar. I would say both of our favorite part is creating the performance, but where we differ is where, and both of these are very valid. I will go into the reference room and act it out a bunch of times, and then I'll take notes on what I liked, what I maybe didn't like. Where he has it all in his head, which I think is incredible because I can't do that. But he imagines it, and I don't know how he does it, but he typically does not shoot out reference, and he will stand up and act something out to try to figure out where the weight is and what's happening physically to his body. Where for me, I will do some of that, but a lot of it I'm trying to look and study the pose, but then obviously, we're always pushing things and pushing on silhouettes. A character should never look or act like me. So, unless it's me. um, so we're always pushing on those things. So I would say my favorite part is creating the performance and getting into rough blocking. I love rough blocking. And then showing to the director, and hopefully it goes okay. We're always going to get notes. And then going back to your desk, I would say the middle part where you're splining everything, it feels like you're throwing everything out of your closet and then you have to re-put it back in sometimes. So that's probably my least favorite part. And then I love when you get the buy-off from directors and then you feel like you can polish and just put all of those tiny details in. I love that stage too. So I'd say kind of the very beginning and the very end stage are my two favorites.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's very cool. And yeah, I'm jealous that Tony's able to do that right out of his head. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I'm the same way. I love to shoot reference. I love to, I do a bunch of takes and iterations and stuff on that. And, it's really useful for my process. But
Yeah.
no, that's great to hear. So for some of our people who are maybe further into their career, maybe they're already animating professionally somewhere, maybe they've got a few films under their belt or whatever. What would you say are some of the indicators in terms of knowing that maybe you're ready to step into a leadership position? I mean, you spoke to the fact before that you kind of hold yourself back or tend to kind of over analyze that. But if you're speaking to somebody who's maybe on the cusp of that or exploring that kind of next step, what would you say are some of the things that are I guess required or sort of useful to know as you transition into leadership?
Sure. I mean, I think doing it for the right reason is a big part of it. And for me, yeah, like you were just saying, and I was saying earlier, I don't know that I really ever felt quite ready for it. So it's a tough one. But I think for me, a big part of it was I love our crew. I love our department so much and was really trying to think of ways of what can I do to help people. We have a lot of really talented animators that have very little confidence. So, what is it that maybe I could do in a head of animation role that helps them either build their confidence or just finding ways for them to be able to create their best work? And a lot of that goes into giving them ownership over their work. And every time I give a note, I always ask myself, is this making their shot better or is it just making it different? Because I should never be making a scene just different. Obviously, if it's what the director wants, it's their vision, but it's working within their vision and trying to give people creative ownership of their work. So that was really important to me. And I think that was one of the driving forces for me wanting to go into this role was just finding ways of how I could help the crew. So it's not that I want to control the animation and the entire film and become the director of the film. It's more that nurturing aspect, and I would say having empathy and knowing that everybody's coming every day into work with different, whether it's different points of view or things they might be going through in their lives, and approaching people differently in that way. That's the other thing that I think is important as a leader is if I'm giving feedback to an animator, there's animators on the floor that, like I was saying, don't have a lot of confidence. And so the way you deliver notes might be more nurturing, where other people, they just want you, just give me your note and leave my office. Not literally like that, but they're just very, be very direct. So I think knowing your crew and knowing who you're talking to is very, very important in this position or any leadership position. So I think going into it, knowing the reason why you're doing it and hoping that a large point or part of that reason is for the benefit of the crew that you're working with.
Yeah, that's great. Are there aspects do you think of being a leader at work that inform your your role as a mother and vice versa, or do you because I heard you mention empathy, of course, and be kind of nurturing, right? Are there things you think that kind of inform each other sort of cyclically as it relates to that?
That is such a good question that I've never thought of before. I imagine you are right about that. And especially, I think, especially as my daughter was much younger, she's a teenager now, so it's very different. Um, but I think so. Yes, just I guess in wanting to be a mother and take care of people. So the same way I want to take care of my daughter and make sure that things are going okay in her life is taking care of the crew. So I think that it's interesting. I never thought of that way, but I would say yes. That's a good point.
Cool. So transitioning a little bit, what would you say if you had to? I don't know if one comes to mind immediately, but if you had to identify the hardest shot you ever had to work on and why?
Yes. This is a really, really hard question. Um, I think every shot is hard in different ways, which I think can be frustrating at times as an animator, but it's also, I think, what helps us grow stronger every day, is because you feel like you always want something to be better. So I think it's so hard for me to pick one shot. It would probably be a shot that had more physicality than some of the other shots. I do remember animating a shot on Tangled where I wanted the shot so bad, but I also it was after Flynn dies and Rapunzel's kind of singing over him. It's a long shot, and I remember being so thankful. I wanted that shot so bad. And I remember being nervous about it though, too. Can I bring the emotional quality that's needed for that time? So I don't know if that's the toughest shot I've ever animated, but I think for where I was at in my career at that point, it probably was. But I had so much fun on that shot. I loved having the opportunity. So I guess that's a way of maybe not directly answering your question. But trying
No,
to,
no, I know
really...
it's kind of not fair with that long of a career, as I'm sure you've done how many hundreds or thousands of shots, I don't know, at this point. So I know that's a tricky question, but no, that's great. Because I know, yeah, sometimes there's a lot of factors that can make a shot hard, right? Maybe sometimes you're going through something in life that's just like hard, because something going on at home that makes it hard, or that you're just not aligning with the director's vision, or whatever it is. You just kind of have to spin the wheels a little bit. But no, I don't. That's maybe not even a fair question at this
No,
point.
it totally is.
No, that's a good answer. So let's see. So to that point, and I guess this is sort of almost a follow up question to that earlier one. What you've worked under, before you became a head of animation, you worked under several different ones and seen a lot of different leadership styles. What do you think are some of the qualities that make a great either supervisor or head of animation? And again, this might be a little redundant to the earlier question, but are there certain things that you think are most important in that role?
Yeah, I think the most important is finding ways for people to do their best work. And that's going to be different depending on the animator. There are some animators that want very direct, tell me exactly what to do, and other animators that want more a gist of can you add more humor to this point? Because they want to come up with the ideas themselves. So when I think back on past leaders, and I think it's different depending on where you're at in your career as well as an animator. I think earlier on in my career, I guess going back to say Meet the Robinsons and working with Nick and Dale, they had such different types of leadership between the two of them, and I worked with the both of them quite a bit. Nick was definitely more direct, but he was so good about following up at the end when you would finish the sequence or the shots that you're working on with him, he was very appreciative of all the notes. And so that kind of always stuck with me, of just making sure people understand that they're working so hard and having that appreciation for that, and letting them know that, because sometimes you're put through the ringer as an animator, right? So letting them know that I really like what you did and thanks for addressing the notes, things like that. I think that's really important. I think that having trust in people, I've admired leaders that have given me the trust in the past. They let me bring something to the table, and maybe it's not what the director wanted, and then the director will tell me what they want. Hopefully I'm not that far off, but I think having that trust is really, really important. I always loved supervisors that were doing drawovers over my work, because Glenn doing drawovers, that was an incredible experience. I learned he was pushing our poses in such a great way and thinking about strong silhouettes. And I think at that point, a lot of our team was still learning the principles of animation. It's like, yeah, you can read this book and now I know the principles, but it doesn't work that way. There's so many things to think about all the time. And so working with Glenn was really great, because like I was saying earlier, our work just elevated so much on that project, and it in large part because of all the drawovers that he was doing for us. But I think nurturing and just having that empathy is something through different leaders that I've always really admired. And I've felt like that's where I've done some of my best work, when I'm not constantly worried about, am I going to lose my job at the end of the show because I'm not doing a good enough job? Things like that.
So, what would you say is something that maybe took you a long time to learn in your career that you wish you had learned earlier? Like if you could go back and talk to your younger self and kind of give them the secret, right? What's one of those things that you wish you had learned earlier in your career?
So many secrets. I am someone that stresses out a lot about deadlines. And this probably sounds very silly, but I think being in this role and working with so closely with supervising animators and directors, the most important thing is bringing a really great piece of animation. And if you're a day late, if you're 2 days late, it's fine because they're going to appreciate all the work. And this is at least at our studio. I guess I shouldn't say that for every studio, but I think as long as you're communicating with production management and saying, look, I blacked out this scene and I feel like I need 2 extra days, or whatever that is that you feel, generally speaking, they're going to be fine with that. And like I said, especially the creative leadership, because at the end of the day, you're going to bring something much more amazing than if you're so stressed out the whole time and feeling like you're not going to meet your deadline. So I think, and that is still something I struggle with a bit today, but I tell myself not to be as worried about that because I know from being in this position. So I think trying not to stress out about your deadlines so much is, while it may sound silly, is a huge thing that I wish I would have learned 15 years ago. I think then there's just, I think sometimes taking a step back and seeing the bigger picture, whether it's the bigger sequence or the bigger film, because I think sometimes we get so into our very specific, 1 or 2 shots and can have a harder time seeing the bigger picture of how a shot is going to fit into the bigger film. I think that's something really important. We get so, every frame and every pixel is so detailed and specific, and sometimes the camera might change slightly and it throws everything off. But then to somebody else, it's like, okay, but that wasn't really that big of an adjustment. I mean, sometimes it is a huge adjustment and it throws off your silhouette, and then absolutely the shot should come back to us and fix those things. But I guess the larger part is just seeing the bigger picture is something that I've learned in this role, because sometimes you go into a meeting and the directors want a slight camera change. So I guess it's being okay with that as well. And just, I think some of the other things that I find, I guess I'm kind of rambling, but being okay with, you might get a big note that you have to rip out the whole entire middle section. And I guess this is, again, going back to deadlines, is that would have really stressed me out, mainly because I would have been worried about the deadline instead of the craft side of it. So you're going to get notes, and sometimes they're going to be very big, and just being okay with that. And you go in. Something that helped me so much is my friend Becky that I was mentioning earlier. Her and I would always go to daily. We were each other's kind of buddy, and she would go to my dailies, I would go to her dailies, and we would hear each other's notes. Because sometimes when you're hearing all of these notes from directors, it can be overwhelming, and you're trying to figure out, oh my gosh, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this change? And then I would go back to my desk, and Becky would say, oh, all you have to do is add a blink here, or do this little thing. Sometimes they're very minor things that can fix something. So I think having someone else that is next to you hearing the notes is super, super helpful. And that's something that, gosh, we shared an office for a while. So we've done that for so many years, but I would even do that today, even after all of this time. If I was showing a shot in dailies, I would say, hey, Becky, can you come with me? And I think she would probably do the same, because it's super helpful just to have another person that is thinking more objectively about the shot.
Yeah, they're not so close to it that it was like freaking out the note. Yeah. No, that's great. We're almost at the end of our time. I like to do some fun ones. just kind of hypotheticals, right? If you weren't, you've had a storied career at one of the top studios for many years now. What if you hadn't gone into animation? What else do you think you might have wanted to do with your life? Do you have any other things that would have been like a great kind of a parallel universe life?
Yeah, something completely different. I would probably become a baker.
Yeah.
I would probably be a pastry
Yeah.
chef. It
Okay.
would be something in the food industry. But I think probably a pastry chef or making breads or something like that. But I love baking. My daughter loves to bake, so we used to bake a lot. I used to take tons and tons of baking classes. When I was on sabbatical from Strange World, I drove up to San Francisco. Actually, I didn't drive, I flew. And there's a place called San Francisco Baking Institute, and that place is incredible. So I took 2 weeks of bread classes there, and it was amazing. I loved it so
Oh,
much, and I
wow.
learned a lot. So very different from
Yeah.
animation. But yes, I love
I'm the
baking.
same way. I always said if I wasn't an animator, or maybe after I retire or whatever, I would love to go to culinary school because yeah, I just love
Yes.
cooking and making things, and
Yeah.
it's a similar part of the brain, I guess, in a way, but yeah, very different. A little more hands on in a different way. But no, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
Um, well, thank you so much, Amy. It's been just an absolute pleasure and delight having you join us and tell us about your journey and just inspiring the viewers with all of your stories and all of your wisdom. Are there any kind of last thoughts or parting words you'd love to leave with people, just in terms of anything they can be thinking about as they either continue on their careers or just anything that comes to mind that you haven't said yet that you'd love to add?
Sure. I think sometimes I've talked to people in the industry that sometimes feel like they're getting into a little bit of a rut. And I would say find other areas that inspire you. And sometimes, I mean, this is something I learned from Melkin on Raya, is something he finds really inspiring is sculpture. So he's constantly studying sculpture. And while it's very different from animation, the really cool thing about sculpture is you can look at those poses and see the anatomy and the structure in there. And so that was something that started becoming very inspiring to me. So I think finding other areas are probably still going to influence your animation. Even musicals is another one for me. I love studying performances of musicals. Um, so I think Glenn used to talk about Untangled when he would feel like he was struggling on a scene, and he would go to Pasadena. There's an art museum there called the Norton Simon Museum, and he would walk around and study all the artwork there. So I think that's something that we don't always think about because we're so into our animation and we're on our deadline and we just have to find a way to get it done. But sometimes stepping away from it and then coming back fresh the next morning, you're going to see something in a totally different way. So I I've found that really helpful for me.
Yeah, that's really great. Just since you mentioned it, and because I'm also a musical buff, what are a few of your some of your favorite musicals?
Oh, well, I love Hamilton. I love The
Yes.
Waitress. I love The Waitress so much.
Oh gosh, I'm such a big Sarah Bareilles fan in general.
Oh
I love everything
man,
she writes.
I wish I could have seen that in New York. Um, I love the music, and I had seen the movie years and years ago. I think I was pregnant with my daughter when the movie came out with Carrie Russell, and I loved that movie. It's
Mhm.
sad, but and then seeing the musical and just hearing the musical, I love that one. I love Dear Evan Hansen. Um, there's so many that I love. I really want to go back to New York. Oh, we saw Little Shop of Horrors with Jonathan Groff. Um,
Oh, nice.
yeah, it was so good. That was right. I think it was 2 months before the pandemic hit, and it was a tiny, tiny
Yeah.
theater off Broadway. And that was such a great performance. So that was another. Yeah, it's hard to pick favorites. So those are my four favorite
Yeah. There's so many good ones, but I'm still trying to see. 'Cause we used to live in New York, so we would go to a lot of them. But I still want to see Hades Town. I'm really
Oh,
looked at the
yes.
soundtrack of that recently. So
Yeah.
good. But again, thank you so much for spending some time with us, and all of your viewers. Thank you for tuning in to episode 5. Be sure to like and subscribe. We've got plenty more great episodes coming. Again, a final word of thanks to Amy Smeed for joining us tonight, and we'll see you all next time.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
Thanks for having me.